All right, today we have the Audio Craftsmen Victoria speaker. This speaker was loaned to me by the manufacturer, and yeah, they didn't pay me, nothing like that. The the same speakers were reviewed by Ron at New Record Day and Steve Huff, and these actually came directly from Steve Huff because they had his name on them. So what I'm going to talk about may be a little bit different than what they talk about. If you want a different opinion or a different perspective, feel free to check out their channel. Okay. So, what I will say is when I got these speakers in, I was actually pretty impressed by the build quality overall. Definitely a different design than what you're probably used to seeing. They've got this slit pattern, which you can see in this video here. And then they feature a couple of the following different specs. They are a two-way bass reflex with a rear port. They feature a 180 millimeter mid bass driver, a 29 millimeter tweeter. The crossover frequency is spec'd at 2.2 kilohertz. They are spec'd at 88 decibels efficiency, impedance of 8 ohm, and 25 to 125 watts suggested amplifier wattage. My overall opinion, if I just crunch everything down into one single grab bag, I gotta say that I actually do like these speakers. But that is not to say they are not without fault. And as I go through this review, it's going to sound like I'm talking about more faults, and you're going to wonder why I actually like these speakers. But just kind of keep in the back of your mind that every speaker is a trade-off. Some of the things that you see in the data, some of the things that you may hear in your listening that might show up in the data may cause you to have a different opinion. So with that said, let me talk about how I had these set up, which is the typical 3 feet off the wall or off the front wall. And I just had to click this to make sure I'm showing the right stuff as I walk through the data shortly. When I set them up like that, listen to them about 10 feet away, the bass is just kind of like, there's really not a lot of bass. If you want low bass, let's say like you want 30 hertz, 40 hertz, absolutely going to need a subwoofer. If you want strong kick, mid-bass punch in that lower mid-bass region, let's say 50 to 80 hertz, something like that, you probably still going to want a subwoofer. If you're okay without having really strong kick, then you may not need a subwoofer. Actually, you probably don't need a subwoofer. If it were me owning these speakers, I would complement them with a subwoofer for sure. The mid-range on these speakers is definitely thin. You may call it hollow or lacking, but it is certainly thin. In my listening test, so I always do my listening first and then I do the data, but part of my listening is to compare these with a known reference of some sort. And lately I've been using the Audio First Fidelia kit speaker. I reviewed these a few months back. This is what I consider my new reference speaker. It's not perfect, but it has a very great tonal balance overall, and it's a good way for me to kind of sanity check things that I'm hearing. So when I listened to the Audio Craftsman, it sounded like, it sounded good overall. It's just like, all right, these are very mellow, laid back kind of sound. And usually when you use those terms to describe a speaker, it's because the high frequency is rolled off. Typically, that's how it's described. Now, the high frequency on the speaker is rolled off if it's not pointing directly at you. But in this case, I had them pointed directly at me. Comparing them to the Audio First, you could definitely tell that the mid-range was more hollow in the Audio Craftsman. Now, this is one of those things where it's kind of tricky. And you may not have an issue with it. It doesn't stand out as a problem per se. Let's say like you have a high frequency boost somewhere at 4 to 6K and it stands out as very sibilant. Or you have a nasally sound coming from like 1 to 2K where it's just like somebody's talking like this and stuff doesn't sound right. Those things will stand out as negatives to me, and it's something that I cannot listen to a speaker for. This particular speaker, it wouldn't bother me to the extent that I could not enjoy the speaker, but if I'm looking for fidelity, that's a problem. And it seems like the design came up short in terms of baffle step compensation. Now, usually when I notice this hole in the response, it's quickly followed by a strong resonant mid-bass peak. Most of the speakers that I reviewed that had this hole in the mid-range tend to have that attribute. So let's talk about one example that's somewhat recent, the Borson X3. Very strong 80, 90 hertz peak of about like plus 7 decibels. And then a hole in the mid-range. That hole in the mid-range, I wasn't the only one to notice it. Many others noticed it as well. But it was set off more because of that strong mid-bass peak. So these speakers don't have that. They have a notch in that mid-range, and it's about an octave, maybe 2 octaves wide. We'll talk about that in data shortly. But again, it wasn't one of those things that stood out and said, I'm a problem. You cannot listen to me because of this. It was just, oh yeah, that mid-range is definitely lacking. I definitely noticed that. Going to the upper mid-range, it sounded fine. Going to the high frequency, that's where things get a little bit tricky. And these speakers really need to be carefully aimed. If they're not pointed at you directly on axis, pointed directly at you, not pointing out of the room, pointing at your listening position, you're going to notice a pretty big drop in the high frequency, especially when you have them pointed straight out into the room. That would be like 30 degrees off axis, like I'm showing you in this graphic. If you have them pointed straight out into the room, you are going to miss a lot of shimmer. You're going to miss a lot of hi-hat and cymbal, and you're going to sound, or it's going to sound kind of maybe dull, for the lack of a better word. When they're pointed directly at you, though, it makes up for that. But again, they are very position dependent. Now, as far as placement off the wall, typically that 1 meter is suggested, right? And if you've watched my last video or one of my more recent videos, I talked about what happens with a speaker as you place it further and further off the wall. And basically, if you can put it right on the wall, it's okay. The further you put it off the wall, the more mid-range dip you start to get from a cancellation from the wall behind the speaker back to your listening position. And then if you go out to like infinite distance, you no longer have that cancellation because the distance from the wall to the speaker to your listening position is so long that cancellation is so high in frequency that it doesn't really matter anymore. So the issue here is that if you want to place these speakers off the wall about 1 meter or so, you are going to get more of a mid-bass dip right in that crucial region, and it's going to be a problem. If you don't notice it, get your ears checked. It's going to be a problem. If you bring the speaker closer to the wall, then you won't have that significant mid-range dip, but you will also boost the lower frequency. The lower frequency being below about 70 hertz. And that's the reason why I think these speakers actually do better when placed a little bit closer to the wall. I'm not saying right up next to the wall, but let's say you back the speaker up and you're about 6 inches or so, maybe a foot off the wall. I would not go further than that. That's my advice. You can take it or leave it. In terms of output capability, the distortion on the speaker is actually pretty good and it's pretty low overall. When you talk about higher output range and dynamic range, that's where a problem starts to occur. And especially below about 100 hertz. So if you hear a strong kick drum at low volume and then you turn it up, that strong kick drum has been diminished because the speaker is no longer to play from low to high volume instantaneously, which is what gives you that dynamic range, that pop, that snap, okay? You don't get that from the speaker because it just doesn't have a whole lot of excursion from the mid-bass drivers that they're using. Now, this is I believe it's the Cios Nextel comb, and I reviewed this speaker in 2013 or so, and I've got it on my website. I found that the linear excursion, not the excursion maximum mechanical capability, but the linear excursion per the IEC, don't remember the standard name now, was about 3 millimeters one way. And that was suspension limited. So when the suspension starts to become stressed and the excursion starts to increase, that suspension starts to become asymmetrical. And that really starts to ramp up the distortion in the lower frequency range, particularly around the resonant frequency of the speaker. And that has a lot of explanation for why the speaker is limited in dynamic range. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play you an audio clip of an original recording. Actually, no, we're going to do pink noise. We're going to do pink noise, full band pink noise, okay? And then I'm going to convolve the signal of this speaker with that same pink noise. And what you're going to listen for is the differences. All right, now that you've heard all that, let's take a look at the data. But before we do, this data is captured using a state-of-the-art Klippel near-field scanner. This device allows me to get anechoic response of a speaker in a non-anechoic environment, such as my garage, which you see in this video. The frequency response of the speaker, as I said earlier, roughly about 84 decibel sensitivity. You see this mid-range dip right here? That's a lack of vocals, lack of thump even, in the upper mid-bass region. Okay, so now we come around here and we peak up around just about 1K. The response above that is reasonably flat. It's not perfectly flat, but reasonably flat. We can see that the F3 of the speaker is 65 hertz and the F10 is at 45 hertz. That also explains why it sounded like the speaker rolled off early in my room. Now, if we talk about just pointing the speaker at you, if we're in an anechoic chamber, if you're outside, all you hear is just that direct sound, essentially. But what happens when you put the speaker into the room? You get reflections, ceiling, floor, side walls. And ideally, you want those reflections to have the same tonal balance as the speaker when it's pointed directly at you, or the direct sound that you get from that first instance of sound. And then later, you get the reflections off the walls that come back to your ear, okay? So if the tonal balance isn't kind of similar between the reflections and the direct sound, then you start to get things in the tonality that don't sound right, but you also cannot fix them, because you cannot fix the direct sound without altering the reflected sound, or vice versa. Okay, so with that in mind, we still see the same attributes we saw in the on-axis response, and the listening window is also relatively smooth, but this big dip right through here, it's about what? It's 200 hertz, rebounds at about 4, so it's about an octave wider. So if we look down here at the early reflections directivity index, which is it's kind of a good way to determine if you're going to be able to equalize the speaker effectively. And the way that you do that is you look for this dashed blue line to be linear. It doesn't have to be perfectly flat, doesn't have to be a perfect line even, but somewhat linear. And when it's not, that indicates that there's a power response mismatch between one driver to the next. So in this case, the mid-bass, mid-woofer, mid-range driver to the tweeter, and that's in the crossover area. And we see that through to this dip right here. Now, really what we want is this to be smooth and continue going on. So there's a handoff mismatch in this response right through this region. This is the estimated in-room response, and this is a line indicating how I heard the speaker in the room. In-room extension to about 70 hertz, what I heard. Recessed vocals, lack of thump, what I heard. Also, if you tow these speakers away from you, like I said earlier, if they're pointing at you, you're okay. If you point them away from you, you are going to miss detail, some shimmer in the hi-hats and cymbals, and that's going to be a problem, okay? Burst decay, kind of people like the waterfall. This is better than a waterfall, and there's reasons why that. I made a post on my community page a long time ago about it. Dig if you want to, but extended decay indicates that we're going to have a little bit of an issue of some extra energy not dying off as quickly at 1.5 kilohertz. Let's look at the horizontal radiation spread. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but the one thing I do like about the speaker is the radiation width. It's a wide sounding enveloping speaker up through the mid-range and maybe the lower treble region. Now, this graphic gives us an idea why. If we look at this lighter red color, we can see that the radiation width on this speaker is at about plus or minus 70 degrees. This would be the tweeter axis right here. And then this would be the radiation off to one side, radiation off to another. But the thing about this speaker is, like most dome tweeters on a flat baffle without a waveguide, they start to narrow at around 7 kilohertz or so. That's just physics. There's not really much you can do about it other than to put it in a waveguide. But when you do that, there are other trade-offs that you have to give up. So in this case, the high frequency at about, I think this is roughly 7 kilohertz, starts to narrow up, becomes pretty laser focused. Now, I've seen worse. I've seen a lot more focused, but this kind of gives us an indication of why the response at 30 degrees starts to fall off pretty quickly. If we look at the vertical response, where do you have to sit? Sit at the tweeter axis, because you really don't have much more than about maybe 20 degrees of wiggle room there. Harmonic distortion to 86 decibels, and then at 96 decibels, for the most part, actually, it doesn't look bad. You're below roughly 1% up into about, let's say maybe 100 hertz or so, but you do have a little bit of a peaking in here. But what about multitone? Well, so this is the thing that kind of is interesting. I sent a message over to Ron at New Record Day and said, hey, what'd you think about these speakers? And he kind of gave me some thoughts back, and I don't remember exactly how it went, so forgive me, Ron, if you're watching this, if I confuse some things here. But essentially, we both said that we heard a little bit of something that sounded a little bit off. And I may have described it as sharp or grainy. I really don't remember. But I told him that it stood out to me and it sounded like it was a higher frequency. So what I wound up doing was I took DSP and I started band passing the speaker. I set a high pass and a low pass, and then I listened to the speaker at higher volumes, and then I would bring that high pass and low pass in, basically band limiting this speaker until I got to about, I think it was 600 hertz and 2000 hertz. And I said, all right, well, that sound is still there. Close it in a little bit more, close it in a little bit more. That high frequency sound is still there. Okay, well, it's not the tweeter. Okay, it's somewhere in the mid range. Ultimately, long story short, I narrowed it down to sounding that it was about 1K or so. So when I looked at the multi-tone distortion data, I said, oh, there it is right there. It's in the data. Now, it wasn't an issue until the higher output volumes. I'm listening 10 feet away. The speakers were close to the wall at this point in time. And I think it was about 90, man, it was like 93 decibels A-weighted at my listening position. Okay. And A-weighted basically rolls off the bass. That aligns with this particular set of data. Could it have been something else? Sure. Could I somehow win the lottery next month? That's possible too, but I've got to play first. And so maybe I won't. But that's basically my short way of saying that I did some due diligence here. This particular area in terms of distortions, it stood out to me. All right, dynamic range or compression. As I said earlier, this speaker kind of runs out of steam at higher volumes below about 100 hertz. Now this goes along with what I was talking about earlier. This is the data set that I really wanted to point out. So we can see that going from 76 decibels, which is my reference in this black line, and as I increase it to 86, 96, and 102 decibels in red, blue, and purple, from 76 to 86, not a big deal until you get to about, I don't know, maybe 60 hertz or so. There's a lot of extra distortion there. At 96 decibels, you're starting to lose some of that mid-range. And then at 102 decibels, you've lost about maybe 1.25 decibel of lower mid-range, mid-bass, just depending on where you define it. But this area around 120 hertz, is this detectable by ear? I'd say it's not ideal. Now, detectable by ear is going to depend on your content, how loud you're listening, and what you're listening for, okay? But generally speaking, this combined with the distortion data that I just showed you gives me more confidence in saying that this is not the kind of speaker that you want to set up really far away from you. Like I would say more than 10 feet. If you plan to listen to these at more than maybe about 85 to 90 decibels in your seated position for the pair of speakers. If you want to go louder than that, then you need to look elsewhere. And then finally, the impedance. Now, this is one thing about this speaker. It's easy to drive. Nominal load is about 8 ohm by the manufacturer. You can see the minimum impedance is about 7.3. Minimum EPDR is about 4.4 ohm down here. So for most AB amplifiers, not a problem to drive this. Just remember that it's offset by the lower than average sensitivity. Based on my experience, average sensitivity for me for a bookshelf is around 85, 86 decibels. And lower than that is a little bit lower than average. And these are around 84, just rounding about 84 decibels. So that concludes my review. If you've enjoyed this review, if you've learned something from it, please take the time to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. If you would like to support what I'm doing here, you can do so one of a few different ways. You can buy some merch from my store. It'll be in the link below. You can join me at patreon.com/Erin's Audio Corner, where you have access to early data, early videos, behind the scenes information, and polls where you can kind of help me decide what I want to do next for an upcoming video. And then finally, you can use any of my generic affiliate links to Crutchfield, Best Buy, Amazon. I've recently included AliExpress due to a viewer reaching out and saying, hey, I'm outside of the US, but I order a lot of stuff from AliExpress. So if you could drop an AliExpress affiliate link in, that would be great. I could use that. So, hey, now you know if you're outside of the US and you use AliExpress, or otherwise, if you're in the US, please consider using that generic affiliate link. Those things that you purchase through those links, whatever it is, earns me a small commission, and I certainly appreciate it. So with all of that said, I'm out. I will talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.